It's my great pleasure to open a new cycle of our OBTAmistic meetings at the Faculty of Artes Liberales at the University of Warsaw. And I welcome you all very, very warmly. And my special welcome goes to Hamish Williams, our speaker today. Hamish holds a PhD in Ancient Greek Literature from the University of Cape Town, and he's also a Humboldtian. He accomplished his Humboldt fellowship at the University of Vienna. He works at the University of Groningen, and now he's in Warsaw as a junior fellow at the Polish Institute of Advanced Studies in Warsaw. And his research comprises classical reception studies, literary studies, fantasy writing. He also writes fantasy stories for children. And we have also in our library his book, the edited volume Tolkien and the Classical World. So he's one of the pioneers of research on Tolkien and the classics. And in fact, he was our guest in 2019, and he had a lecture within the OBTAmistic cycle on classical building, world building among the Inklings. And today he will talk about Tolkien's Utopianism and the classics. And after his lecture, there will be a discussion moderated by my dear colleague Elżbieta Olechowska. So Hamish, this Zoom floor is yours. Thank you very much for giving us your time and having a lecture within our cycle. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Katarzyna, for inviting me to this. And I'm really delighted to speak to you all again today. Right, so today I'll be talking to you about Tolkien's Utopianism and the classics. Okay, so let me start off by going through what I've covered before. So as Professor Musimiak mentioned, my previous work was the edited volume Tolkien and the Classical World. So this volume didn't really have one thematic focus like I'm looking at Utopianism today, but it was really a broad spectrum looking at the influence of different classical disciplines and areas on Tolkien's writing. So for example, the first section was on ancient history, Thucydides and Roman historians like Suetonius, right, the influence of them on Tolkien's world building, specifically Numenor. The second section was looking at ancient epic, which is obviously a big topic for Tolkien, who loved Homer and Virgil. And so there's sort of 4 essays which look at the influence of Homer and Virgil and the whole epic tradition on Tolkien. The third section looked at ancient philosophy and Tolkien. So we had one paper on Aristotle, and 2, I think, on Plato, one on the Ring of Gyges, and another, of course, on Atlantis, which is a popular story for Tolkien, as we'll see. And then the fourth section was looking at ancient, sort of on the border between the ancient world and the Germanic world, which is a popular topic in Tolkien studies also, looking at the intersection of the medieval and the classical. And so that was this volume. And if you'd like to know more about these chapters or have questions about what I've introduced, I'll be happy to discuss some of those at the end. And I'll indeed try to leave about 20 minutes for discussions at the end. So I might need to truncate this lecture a bit short towards the latter stages. Okay. So apart from that volume, my own work has looked at numerous sort of ideas in Tolkien's reception of ancient narratives, such as hospitality, the Occident and the Orient, the East and the West, right? Ideas of thalassocracy, so these ancient sea kingdoms, how Tolkien receives them, right? Okay, so I've looked at various ideas which Tolkien's inherited from the classical traditions. Most recently, I was writing a work for the updated Blackwell companion to Tolkien, which will have now a section on classical literature in Tolkien. Previously, it didn't, so that's kind of a good introduction to some of the broader influences of various genres. I look at tragedy, epic, historiography, philosophy, and so on. It's quite a short and sharp chapter, and it's probably a good starting point for students, I think. But today I'll be talking to you about my upcoming monograph, which will hopefully be released in the early part of 2023, March, April. That's a Bloomsbury publication, and it's called Tolkien's Utopianism and the Classics. And I've already got the cover up there. Right, so apart from Tolkien, I should say I'm interested in other areas of classical reception. So I'm really in the concluding stages of this project. So I'm really delighted to kind of get your input at this late stage, and maybe you know, some questions and some insightful remarks will make their way into the monograph. I'm just kind of wrapping up final editing stages. So I look forward to some comments and interesting remarks. But I'm really at the final stages of this project. My next project is really going to be on receptions of the Minoans, right, the ancient Bronze Age Cretans in 20th century literature and culture and so on, from historical fiction like Mary Renault's work to the horror of even some like Stephen King, to travel narratives of Henry Miller and so on. Archaeological writings, of course, with Sir Arthur Evans. So this is my next major topic. I've already presented a bit of this research to Professor Mosiniak's students on the Minotaur, receptions of the Minotaur, so that might be familiar to some of you. Okay, but today I'm sticking with all things Tolkien. Okay, for those of you who don't know about Tolkien, there probably aren't many of you. I should give a brief bio, perhaps, of him, very brief. So he was born in South Africa, although it wasn't then known as South Africa. It was a group of independent Boer farmer republics, one of which was the Orange Free State, in which Tolkien was born, right, in Bloemfontein. A bit like the Shire in Lord of the Rings. The Shire is sort of an independent farmers' republic. Well, Tolkien kind of was born in an independent farmers' republic, in a way, but there are obviously big differences between late 19th century South Africa and the Shire. Okay, so he was born in South Africa. His father died very young, so he had quite a tragic early life. His mother also died when he was 12. At age 4, he moved back to, I think, age 4 to England, grew up just on the outskirts of Birmingham, later in Birmingham, went to King Edward's School, and then on to Oxford, initially in classics, right? So he had a very strong classical education at school, but he switched then in his, I think, second or third year to medieval studies, to Anglo-Saxon culture and Old English literature and languages, right? So that was really his focus for the rest of his career as an academic. And of course, it's not really as an academic that we know the most about Tolkien is as a creative writer. So obviously his most famous children's work is The Hobbit, published in 1937. And then his publishers, Allen and Unwin, asked him for sort of a quick sequel to The Hobbit, and he produced The Lord of the Rings, sort of published 17 years later, 1,300 pages later, plus appendices. So quite a sequel to The Hobbit, and quite a different genre, not really a children's work anymore, but sort of a modern epic romance fantasy, sort of very interesting hybrid of different genres. Okay, Tolkien's also interesting as a writer because there's almost more posthumous works than there are works which are published during his lifetime. So, and we have mainly his son Christopher Tolkien to thank for this. So, who started publishing Tolkien's unfinished manuscripts after Tolkien's death. The most famous of which is the Silmarillion, sort of this epic saga of sort of divine creation and heroic tales of elves and dwarves and so on. Silmarillion was published in 1977, and there were several other publications after that, in the History of Middle-earth series, Unfinished Tales, and so on. And recently, Christopher Tolkien, who unfortunately he died, I think, a year or so ago, he published 3 excellent novelistic works, Children of Húrin, Beren and Luthien, and The Fall of Gondolin. Now, I don't look too much at these works in my own upcoming monograph, but there are very interesting classical ideas to discover in these 3 most recent works, and I certainly think there's more and more interest in Tolkien and the classics. So you might have seen there's a CFP, I think, in France later this year on Tolkien and classical antiquity, and there's various conferences, I think, coming up on classics and world building, which links methodologically to Tolkien. So we can see a growing interest in this idea of Tolkien's classical reception. And so I would recommend really looking at these 3 more recent works in terms of very, very interesting ideas of classical reception there. So the children of Húrin, we can obviously see Sophoclean tragedy, the character of Oedipus coming through there, as well as the Finnish Kullervo. So with Tolkien, it's always important when you're looking at reception to understand it's also a mixture of different sources. It's the classical sources, it's the Finnish, it's from the Kalevala, it's a Germanic, right, modern, Victorian. So he used the metaphor of the melting pot from the folklorist Sir George Webb Dasent of stories, that you mix the different bones into the soup from all these different traditions, and then you have this mixture which, you can't really tell what the bones were, right? So you mix them all together. So he had many metaphors for this creative process. Another one was like leaves in a compost which decompose and give rise to the story as such. Okay, I'm digressing a bit, but the children of Húrin is one possible, I think, avenue for future Tolkien scholarship and classics, Tolkien and classic scholarship. Beren and Luthien has been looked at quite a bit in terms of its Orphic receptions, the reception of the character of Orpheus. Tolkien once referred to his legends as an Orphic myth in reverse. So the Orphic myths were very important to him as he conceptualized his own writings. Incidentally, he also directly compared his character of Turin to Oedipus. So we have sort of this classical self-reflection. And these analogies have been written about, also in my own volume on Tolkien and the classical world. The Fall of Gondolin is another one which has resemblances to the fall of Troy. There's even a kind of Trojan horse in Tolkien's story, an iron dragon. Austin Freeman writes an excellent chapter about this in my volume, so that's worth looking at. So there are various classical receptions, and I don't hope to cover all of them today. I have my own particular focus on ideas of utopia, and I really mainly look at The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and Silmarillion, but there's much more to look at in Tolkien's lesser works like Farmer Giles of Ham. Also, there's a lot more which can be done on this topic. Okay. So can you all see as I change slides? That's good. So just, yeah, I see some heads nodding. That's great. Okay. So I kind of gave the same lecture to the Tempest from the Polish Institute of Advanced Studies, and kind of one question I addressed is to a sort of a more interdisciplinary general audience is, why should we study the works of Tolkien? I think to you, maybe I'm speaking to the already converted. I'm sure many of you are Tolkien lovers already, so this is perhaps an irrelevant question, but why should we study the works of Tolkien? Why is he an important modern writer to study? So this is something Tom Shippey covers in his work, Author of the Century. And basically he has 3 reasons why we should study Tolkien's writings, why we should appreciate them. Number one, just popularity. He was voted Author of the Century in the BBC poll at the end of the 20th century, ahead of Joyce and Orwell and other writers. Importantly, Shippey points out that many of these other writers are academically condoned, or are writers which are part of the school syllabus, like Lord of the Flies or 1984, whereas Tolkien's writing has been kept out of the syllabus rather vehemently by school teachers. So in spite of what Shippey regards as a certain critical disdain of Tolkien's writings, especially in the early years in the 50s and 60s, we still see him being very popular among the general readership. Shippey's second point is that Tolkien was, of course, very influential in the fantasy genre, and he sort of, if we think of genres as encapsulating certain codes, science fiction is about space and time travel, and horror is about the primitive and the irrational. When we think of fantasy, maybe I think it's just mentioned in the Cambridge Companion to Fantasy that the first thing we think about is actually Tolkien almost. So Tolkien is almost the code which defines the fantasy genre pragmatically. Okay, so when we think of modern writing like George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones, and Martin talks a lot about the influence of Tolkien on his writings. There's several YouTube videos about that if you're interested, or J.K. Rowling and other fantasy writers. The influence of Tolkien is undeniable. Maybe Shippey mentions a third factor, which is that Tolkien just knew more than other people. Tolkien, Shippey was speaking from a philological perspective, that Tolkien just knew a lot about words, and Shippey's really adopting a more linguistic philological approach to analyzing Tolkien's writing, which is very popular. That's his third criteria. I would add a fourth, which is just the reception of Tolkien's works, right, in films and in the last 20 years, but also in computer games. Right, we can go back to the 80s with, you know, Dungeons and Dragons and board games, but more recently various computer games and the sort of Middle Earth universe, how it's expanded as a subculture online. So that's perhaps a fourth reason, is the popular reception, fan fiction of Tolkien's writings. Okay. Those are more kind of demographic reasons by weight of numbers why we should study Tolkien. There are also interesting ideas, obviously, in his writings, which we care about as readers and academics. So one popular avenue of thinking about Tolkien has been Tolkien as environmentalist, right, as a green writer, okay? Now, Tolkien might himself have had something to say about that. He wouldn't maybe have seen himself as a green writer, but he was really appropriated and received, and here we have this idea of reception of Tolkien being important again. He was received by the hippie movement in the 60s as a very important writer, right? So people were writing slogans like Frodo lives and such on subway walls, and he was regarded as his writing as very environmentally positivist literature, okay? So the image of the pastoral image of, right, the Shire and the sort of anti-industrial narrative which we see, which I think Peter Jackson's film The Two Towers, he really draws on this anti-environmental pastoral contrast in his particular depiction of nature in Lord of the Rings. So that's one aspect of looking at it, and I do examine this in my book, Nature. There's eco-critical ways of looking at Tolkien's writings. You can look at nature as symbolic. You can look at nature as actually very Christian, as men, as stewards of nature. So there's all these different ways of approaching the environment. I'm actually interested in nature as an object of sublime experiences, which relates to my focus on utopianism, as going into nature and experiencing some kind of awakening. For me, the sublime is a very important part of Tolkien's writing, the sublime narratives, and so that's kind of my take on nature in Tolkien. Okay, so nature is one aspect, eco-friendly readings, etc. Another, obviously, much talked about school of interpretation of his works has been the Christian influences, and even in my own work, which is on classics, I try to keep strictly to Greece and Rome and reception of Greece and Rome, putting Tolkien in conversation with other modern writers who received Greece and Rome. The Christian influences are undeniably there as you kind of get to the roots of his thought. There are fundamental Christian Catholic ideas, whether I'm dealing with hospitality or ideas of the fall from Genesis or sublime Christian experiences. All these are important in my study, but they all have also Christian intersections with the classics. And I'm going back again to the melting pot metaphor and the leaf compost metaphor. Okay, I can use another metaphor of Tolkien's and then say that I hope that I'm not destroying the tower by removing the bricks as a critic. Tolkien had this idea that as critics we kind of remove the bricks of the tower, the stones, and the tower falls down. So we kind of destroy the aesthetic appreciation of the story by analyzing too much. So I hope I won't be doing that for you today. Okay, a third aspect of Tolkien scholarship, so we've discussed sort of nature readings, Christian-based readings, which is really huge in theological studies, literary studies, right, is really source-based studies, what they call in Tolkien studies. We would say reception studies, studies of Tolkien and his tradition, to use an older word, right? So generally this has looked at the medieval sources for Tolkien's works, but you can also look at Victorian fairy tale sources, right, in that period, early modern sources, maybe less so in scholarship, early Germanic sources, right, and obviously I'm interested in classical sources. So this is really the reception of looking at how he receives, and importantly, an important aspect in his work is his rewriting, his reimagination of all these sources. How does he reconfigure it in his own terms, in his own modern terms? This is very important to his receptions. Okay, so that's the third way. I realize I've left out a fourth very common sort of pool of scholarship, which is philological approaches to Tolkien. Looking at language, right? Tolkien thought that language and myth are always kind of interrelating, and looking at the influence of how language helped his world building, right? So that's the fourth one I could have added there. But obviously today I'm interested in utopianism, ideas of utopia in Tolkien's writings. Obviously, I think this is an important aspect, but this is probably quite a tricky term to understand, and I think we all have our own ideas of what utopia, and probably we should distinguish utopia as a certain place. We might think of Thomas More's utopia in specific places from a more kind of philosophical literary idea of utopianism, which is really what I'm interested in more. But I think briefly I'd like to define what I mean by utopianism. It's a very complex topic, and there's so much scholarship about it in utopian studies, which is an interdisciplinary field, and it has all these different focuses. So we can have a literary perspective, or historical, social perspective, political science, right, psychological approaches. So there's all these different definitions of what utopianism might be. Obviously, in the vernacular common sense point of view, utopianism is often regarded as kind of is often looked at as a sort of negative idea. The Oxford definition of utopianism kind of brings up this this aspect of it's sort of a misplaced idealism, right? It's sort of denigrative, right? That's kind of a vernacular definition, which also intersects with definitions in, I think, political science, which often, almost often in US tradition sees utopianism as sort of almost equivalent to communism, right? And so it talks about the failure of utopias throughout history, right? But psychological approaches might be interested in looking at utopia as a form of desire or hope. Historical approaches might be more interested in the realization of utopias in specific societies, but I'm specifically interested in literary utopianism. And what do I mean by that? So in my volume, in my monograph, I try to come up with a working definition from which I can kind of get to Tolkien's work. A working definition of utopianism. And I say utopianism is a form of literary thinking which defamiliarizes physical space for the sake of exploring and evaluating an ideal. Okay, so I'm kind of trying to include the different etymological parts of utopianism here, which is the Greek u for good, the u, which is the sort of the negative, the imaginary aspect of utopianism, the sort of nowhereness, right, of utopianism, and the topos, the sort of the spatial aspect of this imagining. Okay, so when I say that utopianism is a form of literary thinking which defamiliarizes or imagines physical space, I'm trying to bring in this utopic aspect, right? This nowhereness, right, which was very important in Thomas More's coining of the term utopia, right? This nowhere land off Europe somewhere, right? So utopianism sort of defamiliarizes or imagines physical space. It's also important to distinguish utopianism from idealism as a sort of a non-topic form of thinking, whereas idealism just is looking at ideas in the abstract. Utopianism really has a spatial, it uses space to understand ideas, okay? So it's a form of literary thinking which defamiliarizes physical space for the sake of exploring and evaluating an ideal, okay? And that last part I'm getting in, I'm bringing in that sort of EU-topic aspect, this sort of the ethical quality of utopianism. Okay, and this definition might, as you look at it, bring up a number of questions, which I think all literature kind of has to engage with when it, and as scholars we have to engage with when we think about utopianism in literature. So is the U of utopianism in literature always positivist? Like in a sort of political pamphlet, right, which we expect in the genre of political pamphlet, or is it can it be maybe an exploration or mediation of ideals and values from positive to ambiguous to negative? And this is something which I see in Tolkien's writing. We can also sort of look at the topic aspect of utopianism, because utopianism is often imagined in certain terms, like as an island, which really draws on certain genre, which is of the genre of utopian fiction in the early modern writing, from Thomas More's writing to Campanella and so on to the 19th century. So they often envisage utopia as a sort of island or faraway place, but we can also envisage it as a city in a modern genre of sort of dystopian fiction with Orwell and Huxley and so on. We can envisage it as sort of a mountainous Shangri-La, sort of a Buddhist reclusive place, right? Someone like Lawrence Durrell's fond of such a depiction of utopias. We can think in science fiction in terms of different planets in space, right, and so on. So I'd like to suggest that the topos of utopianism can be quite broad. It's really down to the different genres of writing, what this topos is. For me, fantasy, I'll look at Tolkien's writing in terms of the home as a topos of utopianism. I'll look at the community or city as a topos, and I'll look at nature, sort of ecotopia, as an important topos in which these ideals are explored. Okay, a last question we can ask is the U of utopianism, this notness, this imaginariness, always entirely imaginary or defamiliarized, or does it actually draw on past constructs, right? So this is, can literature ever entirely be, can world building always ever entirely be imaginary? And this is something that Mark, I think T. Wolf talks about in his book on world building, right? That you can never be entirely defamiliar. You can never totally defamiliarize, create an unfamiliar world. You always draw on familiar constructs. So there's also this tension of the defamiliar and the familiar in world building. Okay. I hope it wasn't too theoretical, and I'll be happy to answer questions at the end. But I do have to move on from that. So given this kind of my very general, maybe for some of you too general definition of utopianism, how can we assess Tolkien as a utopian writer? Well, I think it's very clear that he's a very graphic topic writer. He's a writer who's thought in terms of place, of space. And we can feel this when we read his writings with the emphasis given to description. But an obvious way of kind of coming to terms with that is to look at his own secondary role as an artist. He was very interested in drawing Middle Earth. And there's been recent exhibitions of Tolkien's artwork. We can see a picture there of the hill, Hobbiton across the water. So he was very much interested in imagining places within his writing. So there's this intersection between his writing and his artistic imagination. Okay, so definitely he was a graphic writer, he was a topical writer, he thought in terms of place. I would argue he's also a very utopian writer. The places in his writing are, right, obviously ideal, very desirable locations. We can think of the Shire or Lothlorien or Rivendell, depending on whether we are a farmer in the Shire or a scholar or a creative writer or poet. We want to go to Rivendell. If we perhaps a soldier, we might want to go to Minas Tirith. So he has all these different desirable places. His writing is filled with these utopic places we want to be in. Okay. At the same time, they're obviously also very there's several very much dystopic or hellish type places. We can think in terms of Moria, right, which kind of draws on this Christian ideas of the abyss, right? But there's what we can also think of Isengard as a kind of industrialist dystopia, right? As I kind of alluded to earlier, Mordor as a sort of barren post-Anthropocene wasteland. What happens when we cut down all the trees, right? So we have very much desirable places, but we also have these sort of hellish dystopian places in his writings. And for me, what's important is that there are very actually few absolute utopias in Tolkien's writings. Even good places like Valinor in the First Age or the Shire, right, Numenor, the seeds of catastrophe, we can say, or the seeds of dystopia are often present from the very beginning of the story. We can see chinks in the armor of utopia. We can see signs of decay, of decline. Often he contrasts, this is something I look at, this idea of decline in my first chapter after the introduction, or he'll contrast different utopias in terms of, I look at the oikos, the home. We will look at a good home, then a bad home, and then an ambiguous home. And we have to ask the question, is that good home really a good home? And so he kind of puts a whole lot of different homes or these topic figures next to each other, and we kind of have to engage with his negotiations of the ethical quality of these spaces. Okay, also some places are just ambiguous, like nature in Tolkien's writing. I think that's kind of what Tolkien would have had to say against environmental interpretations of his work, is kind of nature's quite ambiguous in his writings. It's good, but it's also unsettling for people to be in. So there are some places which are just kind of ambiguous between good and bad. And so I think it's really important to Tolkien's writing that it's not just about establishing an absolute utopia. He didn't care about that. For him, absolute utopia would have been heaven. He was a Christian thinker, so that's after the world. So when we look at utopias in Tolkien's writings, it's always kind of an exploration of different right models of those different ideals, right? So it's never an absolute utopia really in his writings. on Middle Earth, on Arda, on the world, right? So it's always an evaluation of different ideals. Okay, so I think it's also important we think of, I introduced this idea of utopia, this idea of utopia as a nowhere place, right? And we can kind of think of, I mean, part of the appeal, and Graham, Tom Shippey rather, mentions this in his work on I think it's on Author of the Century, about how Tolkien's writing appears to be a new continent to many readers. So many readers pick up his works or watch the films, and there's this sort of stimulation of novelty and strangeness and otherness when you read his writing, which is so attractive. And it's sort of, this is really drawing on this utopic quality. So you have the early modern period where we have these various utopias which are removed from Europe and which the European colonial mind wants to, colonize. And then in the 19th century, we kind of have the end of the border, right? As who was it? This American anthropologist, was it Jamson, said the border suddenly ends. And then when the border ends, suddenly we have a new type of genre coming up with speculative fiction, with science fiction and fantasy, which start to imagine worlds, utopic places beyond our world, whether it's in space and science fiction or this kind of imagined fantastical sphere and fantasy fiction, right? Okay, so in some senses, Tolkien's drawing on this utopic tradition. But Shippey also says that Tolkien, while it may seem to many readers that they are discovering a new continent, like Europeans discovering, right, Europeans discovering America in the 15th century, 16th century, actually Tolkien's readers, Tolkien would have said, are discovering a very old continent. And this is a kind of a crucial point in my analysis, that Tolkien, his utopianism is really a form of retro-utopianism. So there is this strange, defamiliarized aspect, but it's also his work's also very somehow familiar and recognizable. And we can examine this recognizableness of places in his writing in various respects. We can think of it in terms of medieval literature and later periods, but I'm particularly interested in classical places, which Tolkien receives and rewrites in his works. And there are many of these. So we can think of Numenor as related to Plato's Atlantis. Tolkien even refers to this compound as Numenor-Atlantis in his letters. There might be also resemblances to other classical paradises like Homer, the Homeric Scheria or Minoan Crete, which is also a modern construct actually, or Islands of the Blessed, and so on. So there's various classical places which might be amalgamated into this this place of Numenor. Numenor actually could also be a type of late Rome. It could also be a Trojan sphere. So there's kind of this really dense, it's the most classical place in Middle Earth. It's really like in Arda, it's really like a classical palimpsest. You can see Rome, you can see Troy, you can see Atlantis in Numenor. So it's probably the most work has been done on from a classical point of view on Tolkien's Numenor. Gondor is another place I look at in my book. So for me, it rewrites certain ideas of Rome, a certain picture of Rome. Obviously, that's a very broad topic. Who's Rome? It's kind of a collective image of Rome, a collective cultural historical picture of Rome. But Gondor has also been looked at as a kind of quasi-Troy. Tolkien compares it in latitude to Troy. There's been some analysis on that. Ecbatana, the city from Herodotus, right? The Persian city, right? So having 7 levels, right, like Minas Tirith. It's also been compared to Egypt and a sort of monumental architecture and an interest in tombs. So there's all these different classical images which are coming into Gondor. In Tolkien's The Hobbit, there's several places I look at in terms of homes, which might draw on specifically Homeric homes, oikoi in Homer. One example is the Trolls, the home of the 3 trolls, the fireplace there, which is drawing on Polyphemus's cave. There's been some scholarship on this already. I've written about this quite a bit. And we can also look at certain spheres of the natural world as receiving classical places. So that might be, I look at the Old Forest as perhaps being similar to the forests we see in Ovid's Metamorphoses and in Book 3 in the Thebaid, but also in other ancient forests. Okay, so important for me is that Tolkien's not just receiving these ancient places like someone who's interested in just material culture and is going around the ruins and just, okay, Gondor is Rome, plonk, there it is, right? But he's actually interested in how these ancient narratives of Rome, of Atlantis, of the various Homeric homes how these narratives explore these places on ethical, idealistic, perfective kind of ways. We can call these sort of ancient utopian narratives, right? Ancient narratives which explore the value of these places. And so I should probably wrap up here because I won't even get to the analytical part of my work. But I'm interested in three kind of broader narratives which Tolkien receives. One is Lapsarian narratives. So that's just a fancy way of saying narratives of the fall. Tolkien was very interested in this idea of the fall. He said all stories are about the fall. Now, obviously, this has a very Christian Genesaic aspect to it, right? And the Adamic fall, the fall of Adam, right? And we know this, and there's been writings on this on Tolkien's Silmarillion, how it receives the Christian, the biblical fall. Certainly, okay, but it also receives various classical narratives of the fall, and this is what I look at in that chapter: the fall of an idealized Atlantis in the form of Numenor, and the fall of an idealized Rome in the form of Gondor. So what's important in these narratives of the fall is that Tolkien's not just receiving places, but he's receiving how these ancient writers talk about the ethics of these places, what was good about these places, and when they discuss the declines, it's really a utopian reflection on the loss of certain ideals, whether it's religious, social, moral, political, right? So when Tolkien's receiving Plato's Atlantis, for example, or Platonic thought, he might reflect on Platonic ideas of moderation, right, versus excess, Platonic ideas of an ideal sophocracy, a kind of a wise king. He might reflect on Platonic ideals of a sort of an isolated state which isn't corrupted by seed trade. So we see all these Platonic ideals of place enter into these Tolkien's receptions of his narrative. So he's not just receiving places, just topographically, just plonking them there, but he's really receiving how these ancient writers negotiate with these spaces on ideal levels, right, idealistic levels. So that's my first chapter. Really looks at narratives of the fall of Plato's Atlantis and of Rome, and obviously of Rome we have a long cultural history. I particularly look at the falls around the late Republican period, reflected on by writers like Suetonius and Virgil, who Tolkien was interested in, especially in Virgil. And important when you're looking at narratives of the fall in Tolkien is this idea of restoration. So they fall in order for writers to suggest some kind of restoration which should be implemented at the end of this fall. So it becomes a utopian project for the future. Narratives of the fall and of restoration always kind of intersect in Tolkien. And you see this with Minas Tirith in Gondor, where there is a period of decline, but it stops and there's a restoration with Aragorn, who kind of acts like an Augustan type figure, building marble roads in Minas Tirith. That's quite an obvious allusion to Augustus, having like this urban infrastructural renewal and also a moral renewal, like Augustus encouraging families and children to play again in his city, right? So we have various workings of sort of an Augustan revival within Tolkien, this revived Gondor. Okay, so that's the sort of thing I'm doing in that chapter. My second chapter is looking at, as I said before, the oikos, the Homeric home. Particularly, I'm interested in looking at The Hobbit as a story of Homeric hospitality, where there's a progression from an inhospitable state at the start of the story to various models or paradigms of very hospitable, very inhospitable, and kind of ambiguous home receptions. And then at the end of the story, there's a resolution of this earlier inhospitality. And we see at the end of the story, Bilbo is suddenly very xenophilic and welcoming strangers to his home, right? So that's kind of the crux of my second chapter. But maybe I should stop there, and if you have questions about the Sublime and Tolkien, feel free to ask, but I want to save some time for questions. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to some interesting questions.
Thank you very much. It was most interesting, and I'm sure people have lots of questions. For me, Tolkien, Hobbit and Lord of the Rings are also a universal theme of the evolution of humanity. We have there clearly the age of the elves and the age of men that is coming, and then a sort of separation between what you call sublime and what is normal life. How do you, because you did not mention that, and that is of course also in some ways could have been inspired by Ovid. So what do you think about this theme?
I'm not sure I quite understand the allusion to Ovid. Are you thinking about a specific part of Ovid, of the four ages? The ages of. That's certainly something I'm looking at, of declining of the ages in my first chapter on what I call Lapsarian narratives. And certainly in Tolkien, obviously he's labeled his legendarium the first age, right? The second age, the third age, and we end in the fourth age. So we do have this sort of, there's 4 ages. So that does seem to allude to, there's some scholarship on this already, if that's a direct allusion to Ovid and maybe Hesiod, right, who has 5 ages. There are also Christian theologians who had divided Christian history into 3 ages, I believe. Okay, I can't remember the name now, but there was at least one, so that could also be an influence. Okay, I'm trying to think what more to say about that Lapsarian aspect. So for me, I'm struggling to kind of connect that to the sublime, because I looked at those as 2 different sort of topics. For me, the Lapsarian thing, that's a broader historical question of framing history. An important question for me there was obviously was looking at this idea of decline in Tolkien. Is decline terminal, right, across the ages? But it is kind of, so there's examples of decline from the start to the end. So the elves are continually kind of declining more and more and more, right? By the end of the story, they're the least in population. So there's this idea of terminal decline across the ages, but there's also periods of renewal within each period. The first age kind of goes down, down, down. Various utopias are established in Beleriand, which are modeled on Valinor. We have various utopias, paradises, and they fall at the end of the first age, but then we have a period of renewal where these divine protagonists, the Valar, come and save the day, and Middle-earth is restored, and we have paradise at the start of the second age with Numenor. And so we have these periods of decline and renewal, decline and renewal. So history is sort of circular, but in Tolkien's writings. But that's really related to his Christian thought. So I think there's one letter where he says, look, I'm paraphrasing, I'm fundamentally a Roman Catholic, and because of that, I don't regard history as anything more than a long defeat, right? So history is just this continuous defeat, but there are moments of renewal, which are kind of Christian moments, which are reflective of a glimpsing behind the veil of heaven for Tolkien. I'm not sure how to relate that to what you said about the sublime. That's kind of, for me, about decline in Tolkien. I'm interested in decline in terms of what that says about ideals, how Tolkien uses decline, specifically looking at communities or cities like Minas Tirith, Gondor, and Numenor, to express certain utopian thoughts about what was good, what should a city look like, what should a community look like, and then how these aspects can be restored for the future. So he's not only backward looking, but he uses these narratives of decline also to suggest restorations, and so he's also forward looking, in other words. The question of sublime, I didn't really kind of talk much about that in Ovid's writings, but I was drawing quite a bit on James Porter's excellent work on the sublime in antiquity, which I highly recommend reading. And I was dividing these sort of sublime experience in the Old Forest in Tolkien's The Fellowship of the Ring between the material sublime and the immaterial sublime. Okay, if you have only watched the films, you won't know about the Old Forest, because it was left out by Peter Jackson from the films. But it's really one of my favorite passages in the books. It's 2 or 3 chapters, right? And so for the material sublime, I kind of talk about how he receives Ovidian ideas of nature as profuse and lush and also very dangerous. And this is also something which we see with Old Man Willow, but it's also reinforced by Tom Bombadil, who I describe as an Orphic-like character in Middle-earth. So there's numerous parallels between Tom Bombadil and Orpheus. This is something which Peter Sundt, one of the contributors to my edited volume, looked at. That Tom Bombadil is kind of an Orpheus rewritten. I talked earlier about how Tolkien talked about his legends as a rewritten an Orphic legend in reverse. So I look at Bombadil sort of as reminiscent of the classical Orpheus, because he resurrects the hobbits from an underworld. He rescues them. He uses music to rescue them. He's associated with a river nymph like Eurydice. He's obviously associated with nature, with talking to trees, with music, and with love. So these are kind of Orphic qualities, you could say, generally. So he's reminiscent, talking to Tom Bombadil, of the classical Orpheus in endorsing a view of nature as a material sublime, as dangerous but profuse and almost overwhelming for human beings, which is something we get in Ovid, really, in the Metamorphoses. But I also say that he's kind of rewritten him in quite Christian ways to reflect on an immaterial spiritual sublime. So when the hobbits go into the old forest, they don't only experience the sublimity of the natural world as a material sphere, but they kind of get a glimpse into heaven in this narrative. And so there's an episode where Frodo, at the end of the Lord of the Rings, is going to heaven, Valinor, on the ship from Undying Lands, and he sees the light of Valinor, and he is reminded of the light in Bombadil's house. So Bombadil's house is kind of a microcosm of Tolkien's kind of worldview, and so the hobbits experience this immaterial spiritual sublime when they get there. I could talk more about that, but maybe I should stop for now.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And I saw that there was a question from Rebecca.
Yes,
I think
it's in a chat. Maybe I will read it because she has difficulties with the connection. Do you have thoughts about Tolkien's utopianism in relation to the Lord of the Rings being a modernized epic and all conventions of classical epic?
Okay, I think the first question is kind of a genre-based kind of question. Is Tolkien's, I mean, it's difficult to say, is Lord of the Rings epic, right? Because the ancient epic is very different. It's a poetic form, and it has its various conventions. And Tolkien was really drawing on various genres. I kind of described Lord of the Rings earlier as sort of a hybrid. There's aspects of the fairy tale there, of 19th century fairy tales. There's aspects of a historical romance in English literature, right? But also, I think of classical. There are episodes which are very much reminiscent of classical epic. I think of the Nequia, sort of the journey underground, and there's been a lot of scholarship on these underground journeys in Tolkien. It's a very important part of Tolkien's writings, these underground journeys, whether it's in The Hobbit, in the Goblin tunnels, or the Lonely Mountain, in Lord of the Rings, obviously, Moria, and then the Paths of the Dead. And there's been numerous works of scholarship, some excellent works by American scholar Ben Stevens comparing Virgilian and Homeric underworlds to Tolkien's underworlds, and how Tolkien rewrites ideas, maybe somewhat pessimistic ancient ideas of death and dying, and he rewrites these ancient Nequias in quite Christian, joyful terms. Okay, and he kind of calls Tolkien's underworld journeys eucatabases, kind of like eucatastrophe, Tolkien's phrase for the positive fairy tale catastrophe, which kind of rewrites the ancient catastrophe. And we have these joyful underworld excursions. So there are, I mean, you can think of the underworld motif as being a characteristic of ancient epic, and I certainly see that in Tolkien. I see correspondences in Aragorn, in Aeneas, definitely, as most Roman sort of hero in Tolkien's writings, right? So like Aeneas, he goes through an underworld, he kind of shirks the love interest of the princess from another realm, and he has to refound this, Roman Gondor city. So there are definitely correspondences. So I would say he draws on ancient epic. I'm not sure if it's like conventionally as a genre, if I would describe it as ancient, as classical epic, Lord of the Rings. I don't think so, but certainly it's influenced by. There's one letter where Tolkien says, and this might be relevant to your question. He says that he kind of sees Lord of the Rings with all kind of humility as drawing on this long tradition from Homer to Virgil to Beowulf to Shakespeare, and for him, what all these works, which Lord of the Rings he places in this category, do is that they kind of enact the iceberg principle. So there's this broad kind of myth below the surface, and they all these writings, kind of whether it's Homer, right, the Trojan cycles, or Shakespeare, they kind of draw on this broader pool of myths to construct their epics. So perhaps you could say Tolkien's epic is copying classical epic and post-classical works in that sense. It's not just epic. So that's one letter where he self-consciously compares his Lord of the Rings to classical epic, but not just classical epic, also Shakespearean tragedy and Beowulf's Germanic epics. So it's really like a mixture, but I wouldn't conventionally say it's exactly like ancient epic, classical epic. But yeah, thanks for the question. And I'm not sure how to relate utopianism to that, because I think, you know, utopianism is a polemical concept, and I introduced a very broad definition of it. But obviously, early modern scholars tend to think of utopia in certain ways, and that they're generally reluctant to talk about utopias in the ancient world, although there is more and more scholarship on kind of looking at these paradises and these isolated places as utopias. I've kind of broadened the category by introducing even the home as a kind of utopia, or the nature in ancient world. So it really depends on what you mean by utopianism. Okay, thanks for the question.
We have another question from Bagis Alperkovan. I am sure I am not pronouncing it well. Which Roman ancient Greek writer do you think Tolkien influenced the most?
Okay, I can list several. The top position is either going to be Virgil or Homer. I would argue probably, well, his comments lead me to believe that it's Homer, at least in his early life, but I think maybe there's more Virgil there. I tend to be more interested in Homer, so I find Homer more there, but perhaps Virgil is a stronger influence than Homer. He mentions Virgil on several occasions. In his letters, he mentions Homer as being, he says in one letter he said he first found the sensation of literary pleasure in Homer, and he read the translation of Chapman's Odyssey from at a very young age, and so he translated the Iliad at school. He was very fond of I think ancient epic more broadly. There are certain ancient writers he just didn't care about. So if you want to study classical reception and Tolkien, you shouldn't look at like Cicero or Demosthenes, because he said he hated those writers, and that turned him off classics, was like ancient rhetoric and forensic kind of speeches. So I wouldn't. Those are probably the least influential. I would certainly say he liked his historical works, because history is kind of on a narrative level related to epic, right? So I would say Herodotus, he doesn't mention Herodotus, but he alludes to Xerxes and the Persian narratives in one of his letters, and there is some work on that. Thucydides, he translated at school, so he enjoyed ancient history. He translated Caesar, Tacitus at university. So I think ancient historiography in general was an influence, and of course Plato. Ancient philosophy, but specifically Plato, seems to have been very important for Tolkien. And there's quite a bit of scholarship, not just on Atlantis, Numenor, which I talked about, but also reception of the Republic and Platonic idealism and all this in Tolkien's writings. Okay, so philosophy, and not just epic. When I look at Virgil, I think there's work on Virgil's pastoral works, eclogues and Georgics, which are reflected in the Shire. So Virgil is probably the main influence, and then you have to look at late antiquity, because the question is, when does, this is something I talk about in my chapter on the fall of Rome. It's obviously, when does Rome actually end, right? It's a very debatable issue. When does it actually collapse, right? So there are various ancient Christian writers like Augustine who very much influenced Tolkien's thoughts. I haven't really talked about those much in my work, because I kind of keep it on the more secular, looking at more the sort of traditional secular ancient writers, but certainly you can look at Augustine and various late antiquity, late classical and early medieval Christian thinkers as being hugely influential on Tolkien's writings. I hope I haven't left out some important writers, but Ovid, obviously I talk about, and he mentions Ovid in one letter. I don't think loved poetry. He cared much for Propertius and Tibullus and such. I don't see much comments about that, but I hope that gives you some broad idea of what he cared about. So epic history and philosophy, basically.
Okay, thank you very much. We have one more question from Samuel Carreño. What are your thoughts on Arnor as a falling Western Rome and Gondor as an Eastern Rome?
My thoughts are that it's kind of an amalgam, and it's so in Tolkien's writing, it's never one-to-one. So I know what you're saying there, because I've read that letter where I think it's in the Hammer and Skull chronology of his works. They mention that I mean there's obviously resemblances because Arnor is in the west, right, and it falls first, like the Western Roman Empire, and then then we have this sort of the long Byzantine decay of the Eastern Roman Empire in Gondor. So there is this obvious geographical similarity and a sort of a temporal, kind of a rough temporal similarity there, like Minas Tirith surviving for 1,000 years kind of sounds a bit like Byzantine history, right? I totally get that. But I mean, I'm not sure we can look into much in terms of depictions of Arnor, these battles against the Witch King and Arnor as somehow rebuilding ancient Western Roman, ancient Roman classical history. I can't really see too many resemblances there. I kind of see, and there's been works on Gondor as a fallen Constantinople. I think Libran Moreno is a scholar who talks about that a bit, and she kind of engages in a close analysis of the decline in Constantinople in terms of Gondor, and there's something to be said for that, but it's also something to be said as a kind of an amalgam of both. I see elements of the fall of the Western Roman Empire, or of Rome. It's kind of in Gondor, with the sort of almost collapse of Gondor, of Minas Tirith at the end of the Third Age in Lord of the Rings, we kind of have an amalgam of various Roman collapses. It's really a collection. They all kind of pressed together, because we have Olifants, right, marching on Minas Tirith, and that's like Hannibal, isn't it, marching on Rome, in the 200s BC. Or we have these barbarian tribes from the east, and like Ostrogoths and Visigoths, Lombards attacking Rome at the end of the Western Roman Empire in the 1st century. Or we have like these Hunnic horsemen, the Rohirrim, coming down from the north, but they don't sack Rome, Minas Tirith, they actually help restore it. So that there's kind of like a Tolkien new catastrophe where he's rewritten these Germanic invasions to have a positive ending in his world. So the Germanic and the ancient world have a happy reunion, have a happy kind of rewriting. So I see it, to answer shortly, as kind of amalgam of Western and Eastern Roman Empire. You can also look at the restoration of Aragorn, because this idea of Roman restoration is incredibly important, because we have these narratives of decline throughout classical history, but also post-classical historians, right? And then we have these ideas of what is a revival of Rome with the Holy Roman Empire, or we have the mythologization of that with King Arthur. So we have various historical and mythic ideas of restorative figures of Rome. I look at Aragorn as an Augustan type figure, but you can pick any number of maybe figures of who restore or try to restore Rome in the next 1,000 years and kind of spot resemblances there. Okay, thank you for a very good question. Yeah.
There is another question, I suppose the last one, seeing the clock.
We have also Zuzia. And we have also Zuzia waiting after Krzysztof.
Very good. Krzysztof Rybak says, you mentioned that there is no proper utopia in his works. As for Tolkien, the Christian heaven was one. Mm-hmm. So is there some sort of heaven in Tolkien's mythology that may be still recognized as utopian space, may be similar to ancient Elysium?
Yeah, so certainly there's kind of Valinor in the First Age, which is this elven paradise which the elves move into, and various people have regarded that as similar to the Garden of Eden in the Semitic tradition, and that follows a similar kind of progression where these elves live in bliss, and then there's some kind of temptation from a satanic or serpentine figure in Melkor, and they're then exiled from paradise. So that's kind of, it's a Genesaic kind of Christian analogy there. That's kind of Garden of Eden, but that's not really the same as a Christian heaven, is it? So it's certainly a Garden of Eden in Valinor, and that would kind of also, for me, draw on Hesiodic ideas of golden ages, which are free from suffering, which have natural perenniality of nature, where the gods interact with people. So these characteristics of the classical golden age and classical paradises, not just golden age paradises, but paradises on the peripheries. We can definitely see them in Valinor and also in Numenor. I think more strongly in Numenor as a Platonic kind of figure. I see Valinor as more kind of drawing on the Semitic tradition from the Garden of Eden. Tolkien's actual heaven, right, is never spatially represented in his writings. We have this god figure, Ulufata, who creates the world through this musical symphony. But the heaven is never really represented. It's kind of outside of time and space. So we have no actual representation of that heaven. It's sort of a mystery for men in his writings. So there's no actual representation of heaven in his writings. It's outside of space and time. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And Kasiu, you said that Zuzana, is that?
Yes. Maybe
So
Hamish, you could stop sharing screen so we can see also more people.
Hold on. Stop share. Okay.
Oh.
Done.
So we can see. Zuzia.
Yeah, hello. It's me, the person who prolongates this talk. So you mentioned something which is extremely interesting for me, because I'm observing nowadays this kind of lack or need in literature, especially in fantasy literature, popular literature, and science fiction literature, this lack of positive projects. So there is kind of a lot of, especially in science fiction literature, there's a lot of dystopian projects, but there is, in the end, there is kind of no answer to that, no positive project. And you mentioned that Tolkien actually does this in your works. And if I understand my Tolkien properly, I think he's interested in this in 3 times or 3 parts. So you talked about this revival, renewal after the fall, but also he's interested in good parts in old kingdoms before the fall. And the third thing, I'm not sure if you talked about it, is like pieces of good in the moment of fall, because I think that even in the moments when he's describing even the fall of Gondor or the demise of Gondor a bit before the renewal in the Lord of the Rings, or this before falls, there's always some hints, some little pieces of good parts, good things that last, and they are kind of this mechanisms that can allow the revival then. And I was interesting. Do you see those positive parts of positive utopian projects more as a coherent or consistent, like theory of good, of moral, or do you observe those tropes more like it depends on the race or on the different good for elves or different good for men or hobbits? Are those parts more, I don't want to use this word relative, or do you see it as a coherent theory, or just more of wondering? Because if you sorry for speaking for so long, but if you look for bad signs when things are turning bad in the Lord of the Ring world, you can see that trying to influence or manipulate others' will would be the bad sign. Doing things for greater good would be the bad sign, and more power than you should have for the power's sake would be the bad sign. And do you see something similar like this theoretical or moral parts for these pieces of utopian projects?
Oh, that's a great question, and you've really, I don't know how to begin there. You've but so many great points there, and that will certainly come into when I revise this. I mean, look, we can adopt a broader historical narrative, right? Which I've done. We can look at the legendarium more broadly, and we can kind of see these. We can kind of have was it a parabola? I forget my high school geometry. What's that figure? You know, we can kind of see these falls and then rises at the end and the next age, and we can kind of, we can track that fall, and we can kind of say there's this intra-cycular decline. There is kind of there's a sense of decline, and then we have these moments of Christian hope at the end, where all hope seemed lost, and characters who preserve this the good qualities which you talked about, that what is good in Tolkien and what is evil. That's a big question. We can, and you sort of start talking about what is evil in Tolkien. That's drawing on many different ideas we can talk about, but certainly there's this broader historical analysis where we can see these restorations which have a positive message, right? If we see them consistently at the end of the first age, beginning of the second, at the beginning of the second, with Numenor, with the Shire, which is not at the beginning of the third age, but it's a paradise kind of in narrative time at the start of the third age, kind of it's the first third age place we see as readers of Lord of the Rings. Then we have this idea of return, and Gondor is kind of a restored idyllic Roman Empire, right? We have Pax Romana at the end, where kind of Aragorn goes like Hadrian or Augustus across his lands and kind of claims them back, and we have peace now because I'm the imperial overseer. So we have, again, that's more specific analysis, but we have these periods of renewal, certainly. And does that point to an overall positive message for the book, for Tolkien? Well, I would say, and that's kind of, I'm not really a Christian thinker, I'm kind of more secular in a modern tradition, I guess, although I'm looking for hope and I'm looking for, you know, these are really rooted in Tolkien's Christian ideas, these eucatastrophes, because the catastrophe is the tragic Aristotelian collapse, right? But Tolkien's rewriting that classical idea and having joyful Christian, what he calls the true fairy tale of Christ, right? He's having these joyful renewals at the end of these periods. So I think it's really linked to his Christianity, and I struggle to see if we can divorce these. There's this sense of hope from his Christianity as modern secular thinkers, and I think that's something we have to deal with when we look at Tolkien's work. Can we kind of find meaning in these hopeful moments outside of his Christian thought? That's a broader historical analysis. There's also the individual analysis. You very correctly, you know, pointed out that we have to look also at the personal level, at the individuals in the stories, and that when Tolkien says every story is about the fall, he means like the whole history. Like it even starts before the world was created with Melkor, like a satanic figure, and the very first elves are falling. Really, they're starting to be tempted by these sort of the apple of Eden, right? Right at the very start, by these material objects which kind of offer them great epistemological value, which is kind of a biblical idea. So we have, right from the start of the story, we have this idea of fall. So some people have said that fall is pervasive throughout his story, and it's just a general kind of, we have it throughout on a character level. And to counter that, we have you know, the hope of characters. I mean, when you were talking about this idea of hope, good characters even in bad times, like at the end of the third age, I immediately thought of Faramir. When you said that, I thought of the character of Faramir at the end of the third age, when everything else is decaying. He's the most noble. He's a very ancient world figure. Mm-hmm. People have compared Faramir to the brother of Ajax. Help me out, I've been speaking too long. They've compared, he's an archer, they've compared him to Paris, Tuca. He's a very Roman figure. In my book, editor volume, Philip Burton talks about how he's a kind of a very Roman Catholic figure, because he drinks red wine instead of beer, which they drink in the north in Tolkien's works, and he also has a prayer. He's the only character in Tolkien's work who prays. So an example of Faramir is a very good example of a very hopeful character who, in spite of the decline of the world, and Faramir is regarded as a man of Numenor. He embodies what was good, the platonic good of Numenor, a man of moderation, kind of a philosopher king type figure, a noble prince, which Tolkien cared about. So all the features which Tolkien idealized in Numenor, we see them reconstructed in the figure of Faramir and also in Aragorn. So we have these, certainly the utopian ideas for Tolkien. The Golden Age wasn't just a nostalgic, primitive, you know, ideal of the past, but it uses ideals in the past to kind of be resurrected and restored in the present and in the future. So certainly, I'm not sure. You mentioned a number of ideas. Like you mentioned about racial ideas in Tolkien. We shouldn't talk about race in Tolkien, because post-colonial scholars have had a field day with his works. There isn't much hope for orcs and for such creatures in his writings. There's 19th century maybe racial anthropology coming in there with. I've written about this elsewhere. That's a separate topic. Like you have three Hobbit families: the Harfoots, the Stoors, and the Fallowhides, and the superior branch of the Hobbits are paler skinned, and the more mundane peasant ones are darker skinned. So there's some problematic racial ideas which Tolkien kind of Dimitri Fimi, I think, talks about a lot about this in her work on on Tolkien fairy stories. And so there are some problematic ideas, 19th century anthropology, which Tolkien unfortunately inherited, and you can analyze, and there's been some criticism of depictions of race in his writings, and there's obviously been some staunch defenses of race in his writings. But that's kind of a side point. I can't really answer all your questions. You also kind of talked about evil. I don't want to get into that, whether it's Manichaean or Augustine and Tolkien's writing is a huge debate, but thanks for a very good question.
We have to finish now, no, Kasia?
Yes. Thank you very much, Bisiu, for the moderation. Thank you all for such a vibrant discussion and so many wonderful questions put for all of us. And first of all, I wish to thank very warmly Hamish. And as we all know, roads go ever on. And I believe it's not our last meeting. So please visit us again and keep an eye on our website. I will also always share the invitations to our OBTAmistic cycle, and I also hope very much that we can host Hamish again, maybe after your book appears or with another project. So thank you very much for your time, and this message of hope from your last also answer is also a very beautiful end to our meeting today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you everyone for really wonderful questions and for being a great audience. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.